Hey everyone, it's Noor, here with another episode of AdTech Unfiltered. This time we're talking about mentorship in the AdTech world. I'll be speaking with Matt Barash about it, an executive leader well known in the AdTech industry. Matt was recently placed on a shortlist for Exchange Wire's 2021 Ad Personality of the Year. He's an advisor to numerous AdTech and AdTech adjacent companies, including Safeguard Privacy, Lucky Labs, MediaShift, Reveal Mobile, and a few others. He's been a BizDev leader at Forbes, AdColony, SessionM, Zeotap, and others. Matt can speak to a lot of different things in AdTech, but he brings tremendous value to our discussion on mentorship. He's no stranger on the topic, and I ask him a ton of questions about who needs mentorship, how should you seek it, what should it look like, and where can you find it. As a longtime AdTech professional, he's been the beneficiary of mentorship himself and one who shares it with others. Also worth mentioning, at the time of this recording, Matt Barash was the SVP of BizDev at Zeotap. He has since moved on to pursue new opportunities in the AdTech ecosystem. Matt is a no BS type of person who speaks his mind openly. This is the kind of person I love to interview for the show, and also the type of person to share some thoughtful and meaningful advice. This episode on mentorship in the AdTech world, featuring Matt Barash, starts right now. I know we've jumped into like a variety of different talking points, but I feel like I might have to take us back to the beginning. Earlier on, you had mentioned that you work for Zeotap, and I'm sure many people are familiar with Zeotap, but at the same time, we work in such a fragmented industry in ad tech. Can you give a little bit of background about yourself, Zeotap, what brought you there, and what you're doing there?
Sure. Thanks for having me. God, where do I start? I've been doing this for a long, long time. I think my story starts, growing up here in New York. I was infatuated with media growing up. I thought media was really cool. I thought magazines were amazing. I used to turn on the broadcast networks every night. And so I went off to the University of Wisconsin. And in my first week in 1995, I was introduced to this thing called Yahoo. And Yahoo was this window to the world, which I never knew existed, right? I could get all of the sports information I wanted at my fingertips. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. This is going to be something. But it was 1995, and it wasn't like anyone had taught me what the internet was. I knew that there were a couple of like CD-ROMs floating around in magazines I had gotten that had CompuServe or AOL discs, but my parents weren't willing to give me the $10 a month to spend on it. And so I was a communications major at the University of Wisconsin. I decided that it was a good idea to go out and find an internship. I slung a resume to NBC, and it got picked off a desk by a woman named Lindy Yaccarino, who today has a pretty powerful job there. And from there, I spent a couple summers with her. I graduated from college. It was the late 90s. The dot-com boom was like alive, well, healthy. And, I was like, what do I want to go do? And so I went to go work for the Discovery Channel. And I put 60 to 80 hours a week into a broadcast responsibility, but also let's say that 40 to 50 hours were spent with my core responsibility. 10 to 20 hours a week were spent trying to help develop what was at that point known as Discovery.com. It wasn't the digital media empire that they were going to eventually have. I went from Discovery to ESPN. ESPN had a portfolio of properties. It was part of ABC and Disney. That became a little bit more interesting. I spent about 5 years there. I worked at Condé Nast in the print business, and spent some time at Smithsonian doing business ventures. I took a pause and I said, digital is really interesting to me. I understand broadcast, I understand print, and I understand event sponsorship. How do you put this all together? And who's going to win? When you started to look at the recovery of the digital economy in 2004, 2005, there were a bunch of ad networks that were coming back. They had launched in the mid 90s to help publishers to monetize because they didn't have dedicated sales teams. They had fallen flat in the late 90s when the bubble burst, and then they were starting to recover. And so I went to go work for a company called 24/7 Real Media. It's really fortunate to sit at this intersection where the legacy digital business and the future programmatic were being defined. And We built a great business, but unfortunately, Murdoch was a little fickle, decided he didn't want to be in the digital space. He let go, and I went on to Forbes. And so spent a couple years at Forbes, got into mobile and spent a couple of years at Ad Colony. We sold Ad Colony to Opera, spent time at Opera, launched a global programmatic business at Opera. I left, I went back, and now I sit at Zeotap. And Zeotap is a European CDP based in Berlin. I sit here in New York as the only employee in the US, and my responsibility is really overseeing business development. And what that means is we've got an identity business helping publishers, marketers, and ad tech companies to solve for a cookieless future, which is coming fast. We've got a data marketplace where we've got a third party taxonomy, a lot of which comes from our relationships with telcos throughout the region, where we help marketers to focus on their addressable needs. I've got oversight over our channel business. And so how we help our CDP customers to activate against media, whether it be within Google, Snapchat, Facebook, or other channels such as email or SMS or call center, where they might want to be able to take those first-party data assets, which are becoming more and more valuable every day, and use those in a world where the model that they've operated against historically is about to be blown to smithereens, and they're going to have to be really smart moving forward. So that's a really long-winded answer into who I am and where I've been and what I'm doing. But, I think it ties nicely into what we want to talk about today.
That's the tricky thing about you, Matt, is you have a lot of insight, thoughts, reflections to share on so many things having to do with the ad tech industry. You just shared this really long laundry list of places that you have worked at. I mean, just to do a really fast recap for people, it's like everything you can think of, right? The mention of Fox, Forbes, Session M, Ad Colony. More recently, now you're with Zeotap. I mean, I haven't even mentioned also all the places that you're doing advisory work for. We'll get into that. But something that you mentioned at the very beginning was that you very early in your career had an appreciation for the trajectory of where you felt the industry was headed. And I think you've oftentimes bet correctly. And that's something, that foresight is something that maybe a lot of people don't always have. That's why we're talking about mentorship today with you and the importance of getting good advice, good advisors, turning to people who are meaningful role models, educating yourself. I'll just back up and go to the very beginning. Mentorship in ad tech, is it important? And is that something that you pursued early in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to look to a variety of different people and surround yourself with diversity to be able to become smarter and better at what you do. This is an incredibly complex industry. The ad tech space, you just look at Illumiscape, and I always, make the same joke, which is some people look at that thing and it's like a seeing eye chart, right? Some people are nearsighted, some people are farsighted, but very, very few people see that thing and recognize it with 20/20 vision and precision. And so it's important to understand, how to leverage people who have specific expertise to help you assemble the pieces of the puzzle that will make you better, smarter, and more informed, or better informed. And there's no way to know everything, right? But, if the most important asset is intelligence and knowledge and market knowledge, we're all sort of exposed to what we know on our day to day. But it's really important to have open and honest conversations about things that work, things that don't work, challenges, struggles, successes, wins, and to have those with your peers, with your competitors, with your customers, because that's how you start to recognize how you build for the future. And so a long time ago, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up in my early 20s, and now I sound like the old guy, I had a mentor, and today he's a former White House official who runs a large hedge fund. He said to me, he used to take me to the Harvard Club every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. and bang wisdom into my head, which was the last thing any young recent college grad wants to do, is be anywhere at 7 a.m. And he would say, Matt, success, no matter what you do, if you want to be a sales guy, it's really just kind of an equation. And that equation is success is predicated on exposure, relationships, and ultimately you get leverage out of that. And so I've lived through that every day for the past 20 years, right? How many people can I talk to? How do I build those relationships? How do you build that bridge? How do you build that bond? How do you ask questions? How do you get to know people? And how do you get people to buy into you so that you become an intrinsic part of their day to day or week to week? And there's some element of reciprocity there. And so finding a mentor can come in a couple different ways. It can be someone who understands your industry, can be someone who can help you with your career, can be someone who just makes you a better person. It's really important to really sort of build your own personal advisory board and help you to understand in a world where, again, so much of what we do is being defined on the fly, that you start to make informed decisions and you're surrounded by people who can be really objective and help you because they understand a little piece of that puzzle and help you put together the macro to really have a broader recognition of the direction you want to go in and how to get there effectively moving forward.
So I think many of the things you described as far as what you were able to gain from your mentor and also how you define mentorship is what people want. Going one step before what you described, which is that you had a mentor, that you had a standing meeting with them, that there was all these different pieces of information and insight that were being shared by that person and absorbed by you. People don't know where to start to find that person who's actually going to invest in me and who's the appropriate person for me. And incidentally, one thing that you mentioned now, and I wanted to ask you about is, do you find somebody who works in your business, or is that not important? Is it okay to find somebody from another business? But how do you get them invested in you? So what was that first step to getting somebody willing to connect with you on a regular basis?
It's a great question. I think people are inherently selfish. I hate to say that, right? And so, finding someone who's willing to spend the time and talk openly and share their experiences and also be somewhat vulnerable about the fact that it's not always up and to the right, but sometimes, it's a little bit of a roller coaster. You have to buckle up. That's tough to find. And you're not going to hit it right on your first try. And so, when it comes to finding mentorship, career development is something that's challenged in the ad tech space and the advertising industry as a whole. We are all working our asses off all day, every day to ensure that, the company hits its mark for the quarter and that, the company is well positioned for the year to come. And so when I look or I advise on how to best go about finding a mentor, I say look at your manager first. And, if you're bought into your manager and your manager is bought into you, that's the first step towards success, right? Odds are they're a little bit more senior, they're a little bit more experienced, and, perhaps they can impart some words of wisdom to help you be better at what you're doing in your core competency and your core role and responsibility. Get out and go to, networking events if you can. Get to know people. I know it's a bit of a weird time, right? It's COVID, we're starting to step out a little bit more, but, have a cup of coffee with someone. Don't be shy. I get lots of messages on LinkedIn and I reply to every single one of them saying, hey, I want to pick your brain on this, or, hey, I saw you tweeted about that. And I do make every effort that I can to be courteous and to acknowledge when someone has taken the time to reach out to me. And so don't be shy. Again, ask people for their time. You'll be surprised. People will give it back. No one teaches career development. Some organizations and some companies have great HR, functions, which can help to encourage career development. But, really it's on the employee and it's on some great senior leaders out there to really want to take that step and take it upon themselves to actually activate on that.
One thing you mentioned just now is don't be afraid to reach out and ask. And I think that's a step that a lot of people are definitely afraid to make because they don't want to be rejected. Or another piece of the issue is they don't know what they want out of the mentorship. I think that's something where there are even programs today for various industries where they want to pair you up with a mentor with a mentee. And then that person doesn't actually know what they're looking for. They're just hoping and praying for some sort of wisdom. How much responsibility do you think falls on the mentee versus the responsibility that falls on the mentor to make sure you're getting the most out of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of 50-50. I think Mike Tyson once said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. In today's digital ecosystem, we've all got a series of jobs, whereas our parents might have had careers. I'd love to sit here and tell you that I've got a 5-year plan, but I don't. I think, as I've looked at my career over the past 20 years, I started in broadcast, I moved to print. I didn't know that print would die. I then got into digital and the ad network business. I didn't know the ad network business would die. I skipped into programmatic. I started to see the value there. I got into mobile. I started to think a step ahead. And in doing so, I think part of what was helpful for me was sitting and asking questions to people who I thought really understood how the game would be played. They were doing things in the present tense to drive great businesses and to really help shape a market. But I was really keen to ask questions as the mentee or even just the friend where, I would say, hey, like, it's really interesting, but, header bidding, I'm starting to hear more and more about it. Is this something that you think is going to be a key part of your business moving forward? Or, I remember having a conversation with Adam Bain when he was at Twitter running sales. And, we were talking about the app economy. And we were talking about, I had been at a large app company at the time, Ad Colony, and he was starting to sort of poke around and say, hey, our core business at Twitter is selling ads on Twitter.com or on the Twitter app, but we're starting to think about third-party business. Like, who runs an interesting one? Is it millennial? Is it next age? And then lo and behold, a couple weeks later, he ended up acquiring MoPub. And so you start to say, hey, like, I can provide some value to you with what I'm doing. You can provide some value to me in terms of what you're doing. And we meet in the middle and we start to exchange information and we start to think about, hey, where's this going? But also you start to recognize, how do you operate? How do you operate as a professional? Like, what is your sense of professionalism? How much time do you spend, when it comes to diving into your inbox at night? How do you decompress? We're all tethered to our phones 24/7. We all sit and, look at Slack and Teams all the time. And it's really important to have conversations where you also look for best practices in terms of just the tactical part of your day to day to ensure that, you're handling things properly and you're well positioned. And so, conversations can range from the highly strategic conversation around something that might be a multi-$100 million M&A discussion to something as simple as, hey, should I keep Slack notifications on at night? I think a good mentor-mentee relationship it's not defined by boundaries. It's really more about, the macro, what does it mean? How did you get there? What are you doing that makes you feel good? Where do you do your best thinking? I just had a conversation with someone over the weekend about, meditation and someone I've known for years who I look up to quite a bit. And I'm like, hey, you're the CEO of a company. You've done a remarkable job of taking a company and going through the growth stage and raising a ton of capital. And now what? And he said, anytime I think to myself, now what? I stop and I meditate. And I was like, that's really interesting. That it's really interesting that you can like sort of pause your really busy day, and that's something that I'm going to start to do. And so, you start to pick up pieces here and there. Some of them work, some of them don't. But then you start to impart that wisdom on others. And I think it's important to just brainstorm, knowledge share, and see what sticks.
I do think there is sometimes the sense of scarcity that's very specific to ad tech. I can't speak for other industries where it's really hard to get a hold of people. It's somewhat understandable. People want to save time for themselves. And also, I think sometimes people are afraid of just reaching out to begin with. How did you get into a state of just being open to receiving a lot of people? Because, you've got a lot of followers on LinkedIn and you also are think you're on podcasts, you're visible, you're a visible figure in the ad tech industry. When did you decide to let the floodgates open and just receive it? Were you ever somewhat resistant? Because I've seen people say, I don't have time for those things. I can barely respond to emails from actual work that I'm doing for my job. How can I start opening myself up to other people? Where did your philosophy come from?
There are a lot of people who look at this industry and they want to be the local celebrity. There are lots of quote thought leaders out there. But it takes some balls to go out and have an opinion. There are a lot of folks out there who they're not willing to put themselves out there. They're not willing to, take a stand or publicly share what their POV is because either they're not willing to or they're reluctant to challenge the current system. They're worried that they're going to perhaps upset their employer, their manager. I think people don't like to hear the truth sometimes. And, in this industry, it's not always pretty, right? Sometimes the baby's ugly. And so I've got the word fearless tattooed on my inner arm. If you think about the word fearless, it actually also just kind of spells out fearless. If you operate in a state of fear, you're kind of paralyzed. If you realize that you're not going to be right 100% of the time and you accept that, that's a pretty good way to, perhaps quell some of those, those thoughts in your head, those demons in your head who, might make you anxious or might make you less willing to put yourself out there. I am very out there. I want to be very out there. I want to be very out there, not because it's self-serving and not because it's great for, the company that I work for. I want to be out there because I love what I do and I love this industry. I want more people to talk about it and to, in some way try to encourage more open dialogue. But also, in some ways, discourse is good, right? Like it doesn't always have to be kumbaya. It doesn't have to be, hey, congratulations, you got acquired, or hey, you raised more capital. From my perspective, there's this pragmatic approach to sort of authenticity and being who I am, not just on your podcast or in, the conversation I might have with AdExchanger this afternoon, but in being who I am, whether it's with the entry level employee who works for me, my CEO, my VC. And I think it's important to just kind of be proud of who you are, be confident of who you are, be nice, be courteous, but also recognize that, again, this is so complex. I don't pretend to understand what the fuck is going on in a bid stream. I just play that guy on TV. I know enough to know what I need to do to operate, but I also know when to ask questions to try to be better. And so, I think to answer your question, there's no point in time where I said, hey, I'm going to put myself out there. There was a point in time where I started to engage in conversations where using social and using Twitter and LinkedIn, you start to build relationships because you see patterns form and you see guys like Terry Kawaja and Ari Paparo who, have really smart insights into this business. And by the way, you don't have to be best friends or have a relationship with them to be able to have access to them, right? Like they're putting their thoughts and they're sharing their point of view, which are some of the most well-informed, smartest points of view and influential points of view in this industry. They're putting it out there for public consumption. So why not be a contributor? And, I think that's one of the opportunities that people have to, again, start to build those bridges and start to build those relationships with the leaders of today's tech economy.
You mentioned Terry, Ari, yourself. I think if people in the industry that know you, I think the perception may be that having this higher level view, trying to solve for higher level problems or, aerial view problems, that's in the wheelhouse of these guys that are at the top. But if you're looking at somebody who's mid-level or closer to entry level and they're trying to figure out what is the trajectory of my future, sometimes they find themselves so burnt out on their day-to-day work that they don't have the time to reflect on those larger issues. And therefore, at the end of the day, when they want to think about if they're headed in the right direction, they're just not making the time. What kind of advice would you give to those people who are earlier in their career and they can't muster the energy to do that self audit on what should my tomorrow look like? How should I be planning for my future in this industry?
Yeah, burnout is real these days, right? I think, or how are you feeling these days? Let me ask you, right? I mean, you've now, gone through the same 20 months of COVID, right? Do you feel like you're working more hours these days? Do you feel like you're good, you're challenged? I'm asking that because I think we're all feeling the same way, but everyone is feeling it to a different degree. How do you feel in terms of like your willingness to do your job, and then is that something where you want to say, hey, like I'm really curious afterwards, and after work, so I'm going to go read 5 articles about ad tech, or is that where you're like, hey, I'm going to draw the line and I'm going to go hop on a Peloton or go for a run or do some yoga? Burnout is real, right?
The nature of my role is that being naturally curious is a critical part of succeeding. I would say maybe in some ways I don't feel the same type of grind that maybe somebody who has to traffic a lot of tags is feeling, or is responsible for receiving late night emails from a client.
It's all fair, it's all true, it's all accurate, and I think it's all subjective, and figuring out how much time you want to spend investing in following a Twitter timeline at night, or do you want to sit and read the trades at night, or do you want to disconnect? That's one of those moments where I think I talk about the love of the game that I have, right? That this industry has been really, really good to me for 20 years. And as I look at my own personal evolution, and I look at the friends who I graduated college with, and they all kind of like went their own way a couple years after post graduation, and then I had to reinvent myself in some way. Part of that was this love of advertising, and this right time, right place, of being in the thick of an industry that was enjoying a renaissance in 2005 to 2007, and being surrounded by really good, really smart people who I wanted to learn from. And so, being able to really immerse myself in just listening and observing. One of my favorite quotes is Yogi Berraism: you can observe a lot by watching the industry unfold and reading about it. And I was willing to invest that time. And I think luckily for me, it's paid off. But, it's a different day and age. And so not everyone wants to sit at home at night and, scour through Adweek or Digiday or, Ad Exchanger, and understand everything about every company that puts out a press release. And so I think those are really personal, subjective decisions, but the investment pays off if you're willing to make it.
Yeah, I think I unsuccessfully answered your questions earlier when you said like I think this was like the implied question is like how do I feel from the burnout, and then in some ways like am I making time maybe to do some of the things that you just described, and that's like a need I think to succeed and educate yourself is go beyond the scope of what your day-to-day calls for, and making time to do this like higher level evaluation regardless of where like what rung of the ladder that you're sitting on today. I sense that a lot of people are not doing that, and some people are, and so often when they do read the trades, it's dictated by what's on their desk today and now, not based on some higher level interest and making time on the side. So for me, that's a really important takeaway that I think is important for me to think about. I think important for a lot of other people to think about is it is kind of like an after work responsibility if you can't find time to squeeze it in during the day, to make time to read those trades, to listen to those podcasts, and hear the perspectives of people who are thinking about gluing all the pieces together if thinking about everything isn't your day-to-day responsibility.
I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Totally. Couldn't have said it better.
I wanted to ask, what's a hard lesson you've learned? You're obviously a super sharp guy. You've made a lot of good bets and they've paid off. Do you remember a time or a few times where you've learned a hard lesson and it's changed the trajectory of your career?
Wow. That is a tough one because I've learned a lot of hard lessons. So picking one is tricky. I'll give you a couple. The first one that I think about is really being thoughtful. And when I say that, I operate very differently today than I did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I worked at Forbes. I was the publisher. I could get on a stage and pretty much say anything because the vendors still needed my business and they wanted my brand equity and my logo. And so I remember sitting at an event, and I was sitting next to Kirk McDonald, who today is the CEO of Group M in North America, and he's a great friend. And I said something to paraphrase, like, this was at a point in time where Yahoo was in a really uncertain place. And I said, I think Yahoo is the next MySpace. And at that point, MySpace had just capitulated. And little did I know that there were some very senior level Yahoo executives sitting in front of me. The next thing I knew, I got a call from the CEO of Forbes who said, "Hey, what'd you say about Yahoo today?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I've got an email here from a very high profile Yahoo CEO who's like, you should really have a conversation with Matt." And, it got me thinking, right? Because I've reiterated a number of times that, I love this industry and I love what I do. And I want to see everybody win, but not everybody's going to win. So sometimes there's a time and a place to share that. And sometimes you just keep it in your back pocket. And so while I talk about authenticity, I think it comes back to the thoughtfulness of the delivery. That's one. Two is there was a point in time where 10 years ago, when I left Forbes, I was really looking at mobile as being the next great frontier in digital. And I was really hungry to get into it. And so I called Adam Bain, who was a mentor of mine. And I said, "Adam, if you were me and you're 35 and you're single and you've got no worries in the world whatsoever, you don't have to worry about a wife, you don't have to worry about kids, I just have to feed my dog and pay my rent, where would you go work?" And he set me up with an introduction, and 48 hours later, I had a job. And I was working for a company that I knew nothing about. I just knew it was in mobile. I hadn't done my due diligence to ensure that I was setting myself up for success and that they were going to set me up for success. And that's the bet that we all take at certain points, right? Which is you take a leap of faith, you buy into the people who are interviewing you, and you're trying to put your best self forward for them. Sometimes that's real. Sometimes that's just a heap of bullshit. And a good sales guy can, sell you anything. And so, I went through that process and I learned very quickly that, maybe I was a fish out of water. I think there's something very scary about realizing that, again, in an era and a time when, we're all in a role or at a company for, maybe a presidential term if we're lucky. I think you've been in your role a little bit longer, so, you're very fortunate. But not everyone has that luxury. And so, if you see that perhaps there's a little bit of turbulence or, maybe the role isn't right for you, that you know when to push the escape hatch. And I sat there and I said, it's going to work. It's going to work. And, sometimes it's like dating. Sometimes you say, is it me? Is it you? Is it me? Is it you? It's me. It's not you. Sometimes it's both. And so, recognizing there's nothing wrong with the fact that it's not a personal thing, right? You may not be set up for success because the product may not be ready, or the go to market may not be right, or the product market fit may not be right, or you just might be sitting in the wrong seat. Don't take it personally, but realize and recognize that it's part of a bigger problem or bigger challenge, I should say. And that, that's not going to paralyze me. That's just going to give me more incentive and get me more fired up to go out and pursue the right thing. So those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah, I love some of what you just said as far as not being afraid to hit the eject button and get yourself out of a bad situation. I think one of the things where people will feel a lot of fear about pursuing new opportunities is what if the grass isn't greener on the other side? What if it's a terrible place? I think there's also a lot of stuff out there, not just in our industry, but industries across the board about toxic work environments, getting embedded into that kind of space, and then somehow feeling like you'll be so affected that you'll just be in some sort of downward spiral, both personally and professionally. But having that perspective of saying like this, it's not me, it's the situation, and it's totally fine for me to walk away and move on to new things.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're all gamblers in this industry, right? We're all gambling with our time, with the compensation we receive, in certain cases in the equity that we are compensated with to do what we're doing. And then, if you know enough about gambling, gamblers love to talk about the wins. They never talk about the losses. And there are lots of losses that happen. I think it's just more important it's important that we start to talk about those, because not everybody in this industry is a winner. While we want to see people have success, have great outcomes, that's not always going to be the case. And so, we can't necessarily frown upon the fact that, people may not be great companies or, killing it everywhere they go. I think sometimes it's the individual, sometimes it's the company, sometimes it's a combination. But, we have to recognize that we can't hold that against them, that, we have to acknowledge the opportunity that sits ahead, not stare at the rearview mirror and get caught up in the past.
Across the course of this chat we've been having, something that's very clear about you, Matt, is that you will evaluate a lot of things at a macro level, and then you're hoping for some bigger, better win for a variety of circumstances, whether that's pursuing a new piece of the industry, taking on a new role, working at a new company, whatever the case may be. What I've seen a lot of people bogged down in is going after micro level trends or micro level opportunities. They're just thinking about, I'm working at this company and I want to get a little bit of a raise, or I'm just looking for some sort of promotion, and feeling that that's the scope in which they're thinking about their future, not doing that broader level assessment of what all is out there. How important do you think it is for people to think big and think on a macro level so that they can see the full scope of opportunities that the industry offers? Because I think that's what's enabled you to achieve so much and do so many different things, is looking at things more broadly. Have you found a lot of people are tied up on looking at things with horse blinders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've always encouraged the teams that work in the organizations that I manage to get out there and to not just stay in their swim lane, but to explore other avenues and other areas that might be interesting to them. And so, I think in some respects, some of that comes back to corporate culture, to management, to environment. There's always going to be a pressure to deliver on what your core competency is, or your core focus, your remit. But at the same time, are you encouraged to go out and think more broadly? I think that there's incredible value to that. I think that when I look back at my time at Ad Colony, we sold Ad Colony in 2014 for $350 million. Opera MediaWorks got sold in 2016 for a lot of money. I left the company, I came back, and then the company was eventually sold again this February for $400 million. People ask me about what the best thing I did at Ad Colony was. Was it, being a part of multiple acquisitions? Was it seeing revenue growth? But for me, it was about having employee retention. It was about the fact that I hired a lot of people, but throughout my tenure at Ad Colony, which was in total about 7 years, that I only had one employee ever come to me and resign. I had other employees leave for other reasons, but there was only one employee who said, I'm leaving. Like I'm going to go do something totally different. And he left to go pursue a career in the music industry. It wasn't like he wanted to continue in the standard ad tech business. I was really proud of the fact that the employees who came to work all day, every day, and helped build those businesses and grow those businesses, that they were always curious. And that was part of why I hired them. That was part of why I spent time with each of them, encouraging them to go out and learn more. But, I think it's not for everybody, right? There are some people who are just doers. There are some people who, by nature, are just happy, like understanding one little aspect of what they do. And that's who they are, and that's totally fine. I think it doesn't have to be big picture for everybody. I think that, again, it's different strokes for different folks. And if that's what makes you comfortable, then there's nothing wrong with that. There's a big growing ad tech ecosystem, which, if you're curious and if you're entrepreneurial and if you're willing to assume a little bit of risk, whether that's in terms of your career or whether it's in terms of, trying to push the bounds of being at the forefront of something, then there's incredible reward to be found. I think that's just a personality trait. And I think that's going to be something that you're going to find, people have a different, tolerance for, or, kind of risk evaluation system set for.
I completely agree that for some folks, staying in a particular swim lane and not scoping so broadly is perfectly acceptable and desirable, but at least doing the evaluation to say that that that's what you want and not an accident of like looking back in time and saying, I wish I lived differently. I wish I pursued opportunities or talked to more people about how I could have paved my path a different way.
I think saying what if is, that's my biggest fear. I never want to say what if. I want to say, hey, like, how do I have as many options as possible? How do I have, as much understanding as possible? And how do I make informed decisions because of that?
Do you think there's a hard part of being a mentor?
Yeah, I think that a good mentor isn't just there to impart wisdom or to sit and like celebrate wins. I think, you have to be there for the tough parts. I was having dinner last night and all of a sudden I looked down at my phone and there were like 7 texts from someone who I'm close with who had had a really rough day. He was looking for some answers or some guidance around how to handle a situation, and that situation was somewhat sensitive. It was a bit of tough feedback from a manager, and it was something where that employee was feeling really vulnerable, and you've got to sit there and and you've got to listen, and you've got to be objective, and you've got to provide some level of responsible guidance, right? You can't just like let it go in one ear and out the other and just like kind of half listen. You've got to be all in because someone's fate essentially revolves around potentially the guidance or the feedback that you provide to them in terms of how they're going to handle this situation moving forward. It's not always sunshine and roses. Like I said, it's sometimes having those tough discussions to help someone navigate the tricky situations. That's where having a mentor comes in really handy, and that's the key value is having someone you can lean on who can be objective and tell you, hey, maybe you made a mistake, or maybe you fucked up, or maybe you stepped out of bounds, or maybe you were totally right and they were totally wrong, and this is how you should address this or document this moving forward. It's not just all positive, and it's not just all, hey, this is what my experience looks like, here's how you emulate it. It's real time on the fly guidance.
What gets you to a place where you're willing to invest in an individual at that level, be that accessible to an individual? What do they have to do for you to be willing to commit like that?
It's funny. I get asked all the time, what can I do for you? And the answer is usually nothing. And, a mentor relationship shouldn't be transactional, but a good, real, authentic mentor mentee relationship is because maybe like you see a little bit of yourself in someone else, or maybe you can provide an opportunity for someone by opening a door or having a conversation or having a cup of coffee that they wouldn't get otherwise, right? Maybe they've reached out to 10 other people. I can think of another example where probably about 2.5 years ago, I got an email on LinkedIn from a guy. He was a recent college graduate who was incredibly articulate in his note to me and said, hey, I'm really trying to get an entry level position in the agency, but no one's listening. Can you help me? And I sat down, I had a cup of coffee with him, and I said, let me see your resume. And we walked through his resume and we made a couple of changes. And lo and behold, when I sent it to someone, he got a couple phone calls. And a couple weeks later, he sent me this really, really exciting email that said, hey, I just nailed my first job and I can't thank you enough. We stayed in contact and we just had lunch a couple weeks ago because he just got promoted for the third time. And all he needed was a shot. All he needed was a little help. And, I didn't have to like rearrange my day. I had to sit and have coffee, and I'm going to have coffee every morning. So might as well have it with somebody new and interesting who, I can get to know. And if I can open a door for him and give him access because I've got the Rolodex and the relationship, then it doesn't hurt me, right? All I did was open the door. He made it happen. And so I take a lot of pride in that. And, I think it's important to know that one day, maybe he can return that favor down the road.
Matt, I would be remiss to not ask you at least one question about all the advisory work that you do. And should I even get into this list of advisory boards you're on and or have been on for Safeguard Privacy, Lucky Labs, Media Shift, Reveal, and more. I think a lot of people, they aspire, at least somewhere in the back of their mind, for being in a place where there is something valid to what they have to share about the industry that they've dedicated themselves to, that someone would seek their advice in a formal way. And that's what I'd say an advisory position very deeply doesn't just imply. It's like that's what it is, that somebody can turn to you for with that level of expectation and that there's credibility to what you have to share. When did that start happening to you? Because I imagine once the ball started rolling that more people were reaching out to you. But what was that initial moment where someone or some organization, some individual said, let's lean on Matt? And how did you set yourself up to be in that position?
Initially, it began with a former colleague of mine who became a CEO of a company, and he was looking to surround himself with people who could really compensate for things that he didn't know well. And so, in my case, he was looking for a better understanding of how publishers monetize their inventory. And so that was the first one. That company was small, it never went anywhere. But, what I came to realize was advisory work, at least from my own perspective, is really about a couple of things. It's about, number one, a relationship with a CEO and knowing that that CEO has a vision, wants to do something that I find fascinating, interesting, and inspiring, but also realizing that it's far enough away from my day to day that I can be involved, but I don't have to be completely immersed. And so, what are the levels of expectation that the CEO has of the advisor? And how involved can I be as an advisor to the business to be able to influence and drive and help and assist, but also realize that I'm not part of the full-time group of employees who are completely invested, if that makes sense. And so when I look at the companies that I've got an affiliation with, I can point to a couple and say Safeguard Privacy is in the compliance space. And I think that understanding more about privacy and compliance today and how data is used and how regulation is coming is really important and is only going to become a bigger part of my day. And so I got involved with Richie Glassberg, who's the CEO at Safeguard, a long time ago. He's been a friend for a million years, but I think the conversation was really natural and organic. It was like, hey, we can help each other. I'm in the data space. I'm solving for challenges around data usage in Europe. He's building a platform that helps essentially anyone who's transacting in digital to understand risk and compliance. There's a good fit there. And so sitting there and having, monthly or quarterly conversations about the health of the business, the direction of the business, the go-to-market, the changes that have to happen, for me as a geek of this industry, that takes me out of the day-to-day of what I'm thinking about all day at Zeotap or at AdColony prior. And it allows me to focus on something that I'm learning every day. And it helps me to understand a broader aspect of this business.
What do you think is the tipping point from when you know enough about some sort of subject matter or topic that is affecting your day to day from whatever your 9 to 5 is to when you know so much about it that somebody would actually turn to you for advice on it?
The raw, honest answer is part of that's reputation. This is an industry where we put great leaders, great executives, great operators, and people who've had great outcomes on a little bit of a pedestal. And I would suggest that that's, in some respects, deserved. I think that, there are some people who just have this magic touch in this industry to just get it done every time. And they have a pretty good feel for how to solve problems and how to find great outcomes. And so that's reputation. And part of it is just understanding, again, like self-awareness, right? How, some executives, CEOs, board members, they know what they don't know. They look to people who have domain expertise, have subject matter expertise, understand how to operate a really, really healthy business unit or function. And they say, hey, we want you to be a part of that. It's about balancing expectations, balancing ability to deliver, and maintaining, some type of level setting agreement where I look at my relationship with, one of the companies I advise, who I probably talk to, I don't know, once a year, twice a year. They don't need me. I think they needed me at a point in time, but that's kind of trailed off a little bit. It's about picking up the phone. There's one recurrent theme here throughout everything that we've talked about today. It's the fact that I try to respond to every email I get. I try to respond to, people who I've known for 20 years or people who are reaching out for the first time, and be courteous, because if they're taking time out of their day to say, hey, I've got a question for you, or I'd love to pick your brain, or I'd love to get your insight, then I can always find the time. I'm always fascinated when people say they don't have the time. You make the time. Time's a very valuable commodity. It's one of the the things that we control and we make decisions about. But I'm always fascinated by people who say they don't have the time. It's about how you manage your time.
Yeah, we're going to have to do a separate episode on time management, because I imagine a lot of people in this industry struggle with that, going back to that earlier point you made about automation. What is automated, what isn't? But we'll save that for another day. I'll ask you this final question, Matt. If somebody is out there and they are looking, I imagine a lot of people are looking for a mentor today, and they're not at the state where they're going to approach somebody, but there's some sort of pre-work they need to do, some self-evaluation. What is that work that they need to do first before they approach somebody who they think would be an attractive mentor?
I think you have to really establish who you want to be and what your goals are. Where are you today? What are the things that you need to focus on? What are the areas that you need to really shore up and and invest in to be better, to get to where you level up? And so having a good sense of where your curiosity is, of where your strengths are, of where you feel like you have vulnerabilities, I think will help you to recognize how to best frame the conversation. But also, I think on the flip side of that, a mentor who's, I don't know, managed people effectively, or just understands kind of the art of relationship management, will be able to pick up on some signals to be able to help drive that more effectively. And so, I think part of it is, just saying, hey, here's what I'm interested in. Here's who I am. Here's what I've done. But, it all starts with, hey, can we grab a cup of coffee? Or, hey, can we hop on a Zoom and have a conversation? If you do that and you open the door, you'll be amazed. People are receptive. People are willing to give their time. When you get on that call, though, be prepared. Be prepared with some thoughts, some insights, some curiosity, some questions, and let the rest play itself out. If it's meant to be, you'll start to see that relationship start to really emerge and really become very organic and very natural, and ultimately, hopefully, be beneficial as you find your person to help, be your North Star and give you guidance.
Matt Barash is the SVP of Business Development at Zeotap. He's also an advisor for a half dozen or more ad tech and tech companies. Matt, this was awesome. Thank you for making the time. And maybe we'll do a follow-up episode on another topic. I know you have a lot of opinions, and I think people like to hear them.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and ready to do when you are. So, like I said, email's always open. Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Matt Barash, industry advisor and longtime biz development executive and noted personality, for all his thoughts and advice on mentorship. I took some insights away from this conversation, and I hope you did too. As a guy noted for his personality across the industry, it's worth your while to give Matt a follow on Twitter and LinkedIn, where he posts pretty regularly. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll give us a subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to our podcast, and maybe you'll even give us a 5-star review while you're at it. Wishing Matt the best of luck that I know he doesn't need as he moves on to new adventures in the ad tech industry. That's it for now. I'm your host, Noor Naseer. Join us soon for more AdTech Unfiltered.